Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is good to be with you this morning on this, what's today? The 40, the 53rd anniversary of Attica? I could be wrong. It's something like that. Um, Anyway, I'm very pleased to be with our guests today. Honored that they reached out to have another conversation. Today, we'll be talking to Huda Amori from Palestine Action. She is organized against British complicity in the colonization of Palestine and against British support for the Israeli colonial apartheid regime in historic Palestine for many years now. Palestine Action is an organization born out of that struggle. Their core campaign, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with at this point, is Shut Elbit Down. Elbit Systems is Israel's largest privately owned arms company. It is the largest single customer. Its largest single customer is the Israeli Ministry of Defense. And, uh, we're going to talk about the repression that Palestine Action is facing. And we're also going to talk a little bit about they've been really busy, like some organizations when they're facing repression, you see less action from them. And Palestine Action is just in the last few days doing some, huge actions, or I should say, and we could talk about the structure a little bit too, but people are doing huge actions, right, through the kind of model of resistance that Palestine Action represents. And so, really great to welcome you back to the show, Huda. It's great to be with you.
It's good to be back.
I just want to say up front to folks too, I just want to thank you, and thank your organization, thank all of the people who have taken direct action against Elbit Systems, people who have done other direct actions like, you know, pro, you know, direct action against weapons manufacturers or these block the boat attempts that are going on in different parts of the world. I think your courage is an inspiration. And, I just want to thank you all for doing what you are doing. It's been obviously a really difficult 11 months for
Mhm.
everybody amid this genocide. And your work continues to be, a really shining example of people who have taken great personal risk to try to make our governments do and these corporations, to stop the slaughter of the Palestinian people and make that untenable. And so I just want to thank you up front, really from the bottom of my heart and from our platform for, those efforts.
Thank you. We appreciate that, and I think, for us, we're just playing our part and doing everything we can against this genocide, but also just in general for the liberation of Palestine.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, that's important to say is that you all have been at this for a long time, long before October 7th.
Mm.
And, it's not just a response. And that, that the vision is for a liberated Palestine. Absolutely. So of course, one of the things I did want to talk to you about is that there are a lot of when we look at the support tab on the Palestine Action website, and I can pull it up for a minute when you're talking, but there are a lot of cases that are going on right now. There's a lot of people who have taken action under the Palestine Action model, and repression has really escalated, I think, in some important ways that we need to name and discuss. So tell us a little bit about what's going on and kind of bring people up to speed on that.
Yeah, so we currently have 16 political prisoners being detained across England and Scotland for acting against this genocide and for acting against weapons manufacturers in this country. We quickly went from one prisoner who was called Francesca to 16 in a space of a couple of weeks, actually. And uh, we've had a marked escalation by the state against people in Palestine Action, and it really stepped up. So we had one action. There were 6 activists arrested inside one of Elbit's buildings. So this is the Bristol-based new research and development hub for Elbit Systems, Israel's biggest weapons firm, and as you said, our main target. And this site was actually opened last year, and it's basically Elbit's prized possession. They spent £35 million building the site, and because of Palestine Action being a threat to them, they had installed security fences and had lots of security guards at the site. It was a highly secured site. And the first action against this site was activists basically drove a modified prison van through the fences into the building, got out and destroyed Israeli weapons inside. And they actually destroyed, it was recorded, you can see them destroying quadcopter drones. And this is the same model of drones that we've seen be used in Gaza, the same model which was used to mimic the sounds of women and children crying in order to lure Palestinians and murder them, basically. And this is what they found inside the building. And the state went on overdrive as a result of it. And we have done actions like this before, but this time the response was quite different. So 6 people were arrested at the scene. And so in England, you can be held for 24 hours without charge, and then you have to be charged or not. And then they can also sometimes get an extension for 12 hours. But after that, you have to charge or let people go. This time, after 36 hours, they rearrested them under the Terrorism Act, which basically allowed the police and the state to hold them in solitary confinement for another 7 days without charge and interrogate them repeatedly, and also use an increased amount of resources while investigating this case in general. And that's what they did. And they ended up across that week rounding up other people from Palestine Action. They arrested 4 others, allegedly in connection to the action. One of those activists, one of the 4, was house sitting for his cousin. And we know this because someone was with him who was arrested and de-arrested straight away. And I think he was watching TV, and armed police surrounded the house. And he said that he wasn't armed and that they should put the guns down. And they made him go out with his hands up, basically, and arrested him with 4 guns pointing at his head. And these are, the counter-terrorism police, balaclavaed up, guns pointing at his head, 3 different police forces involved in these arrests. And it's just an insane amount of resources. And obviously, I know over in the US, you're used to armed police, but normally that's only, it's quite unique to have that happen, to say the least, in a Yorkshire town. And this this happened to 10 different people. They were all held under the Terrorism Act. Eventually, they were all charged. But what was interesting is none of them were charged with terrorism offences. So they've all been sent to prison, but none of them have been charged with terrorism offences. So it clearly shows they were just using the Terrorism Act as a way of taking away more rights, having more powers to interrogate people, to hold them in solitary confinement, and basically just to intimidate them to the maximum. Because I think the state knows by now, we have been, many of us have been arrested. Some of us have gone to prison. And these things haven't stopped Palestine Action. And so they are trying to do everything possible to escalate that even further. So now we have, and then shortly after that happened, we had 5 people sentenced to a year-long sentences in Scotland. They'll be expected to serve around half of that. This is for costing one weapons manufacturer over £1 million in losses. And the judge there said very clearly, I'm doing this to try and deter people from doing this, because it's a very extreme sentence, especially for Scotland, which is meant to be, a bit better, they like to say, than England. But they're doing this to try and deter people. And on top of that, you may have seen that we've had, a co-founder of Palestine Action, Richard Barnard, was charged under the Terrorism Act. And this is for expressing an opinion that is supportive of a prescribed organization, namely Hamas, which could encourage others to do the same. So it's very, very loose kind of charges that they can bring on people. And they've also arrested journalists and other activists recently under the Terrorism Act for speeches or for tweets. And in that sense, they've gone on overdrive, basically, the state, to try and oppress people. But all of this as well we have to see it in the context of what Israel has been doing to lobby against Palestine Action. And it was uncovered last year that the Israeli embassy were lobbying our Attorney General to and discussing Palestine Action's court cases. They were discussing what defences we were allowed to rely on in court and how they can remove those defences from us. And we know that there's corporate lobbyists who have access, they will both have access from the Prime Minister down, and the state is doing everything possible in order to protect the interests of Israel's weapons trade over the freedom and rights of its own citizens. And I think they have exposed themselves, they've exposed themselves even more, how far they're willing to go in order to protect the Zionist regime over the rights of activists and journalists in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does definitely suggest that one, that what you are all are doing is working. It's having an impact. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about some other things that might be related to that as well. But um, that that they feel a need to ramp up the repression in order to try to deter people. It is interesting too. I think the point you made about Scotland, because I remember in one of our earlier conversations, one of the things that you had talked about is a lot of times these factories are uh, in areas that are would be less pro-Israeli necessarily, like less, more people who would have some kind of empathy or solidarity with Palestinians, thinking about, for instance, the history of Scotland and, being colonized itself essentially to be a part of the United Kingdom, or Northern Ireland or areas, and so it's interesting to see, because I remember at one point we had talked about jury trials, and you had said, that you didn't think that juries would necessarily want to convict Palestine Action folks for taking what was a very principled stance against, you know, war crimes, basically, right? To trying to stop that. Um, so I'm interested a little bit. Maybe we could talk about that a little bit. Of,
Mm.
you know, is it judges and kind of attorney generals in the state that's now pushing down on harder? Is there a change at all you're seeing in the populace around these issues?
Well, there's a few things. I mean, one of the things is that the criminal system is not consistent at all. So you could have a different judge and have a completely different outcome. And there's no denying that judges are going to have their own political views, and they have a lot of leniency to either send people to prison or give them a slap on the wrist, basically. And they're going to choose according, and they're going to be swayed by their political views. They'll say, "Oh, they're completely objective." That's complete nonsense. It's complete crap. But in terms of jury trials in general, when in our first couple of years of Palestine Action, we won every single court case, and we've seen minutes where Elbit is complaining to the state that we're winning court cases and that people are being acquitted because we would rely on defenses that our actions were proportional to the crimes that Elbit is committing, and that what we are doing is necessary to save human life and is also preventing the much bigger crime. These are all defenses enshrined into British law. But what has been going on recently is the state have been doing everything possible to try and minimize the potential to use these defenses. And in some cases, people have been allowed to rely on these defenses, and in some cases, they've been told they can't. So there's just not really consistency there. And part of it is also, as activists, we go into the courtroom knowing that this can happen and knowing that we can fight our case anyway and make our voices heard, and that the action continues even in that courtroom, even when you're faced against a system which is trying to silence you. Because actually just speaking out about Palestine and Elbit when they're trying to shut you up basically is an act of resistance in itself at that point. For example, I was on trial at the end of last year for 6 or 7 weeks, and I was charged with like 11 different charges. We won a few of those charges. We were acquitted. And on the rest, the jury couldn't reach a majority decision. I'm convinced part of that was because we didn't have the defenses that we wanted to rely on, but we did have a defense we could rely on. By the time we go, then now they want to trial us again, because they can choose to do that if they haven't got a decision on some of the charges, and the state have chosen to retrial us. By the time we go and have a retrial, that defense won't exist anymore because they would have changed the law. So you can have done an action and the law will be one way, and by the time you get around, depending on what the state has done to change the law, it can look very different. But nonetheless, I personally, I'm not going to play. I wouldn't plead guilty, and I state my case and appeal to a jury and explain what's going on and try and expose the system and use the courtroom as a place to show our resistance against British complicity. And part of the complicity is what they're doing to try and oppress activists who are acting against it. And so that's a crucial part of it. But there is still cases that are being won despite all of this. Just a few months ago, we had an action in 2021 where people occupied the roof of a factory for 6 days, and they were charged with criminal damage. They were taken before a jury. They explained that their actions were done to save life and prevent the greater crime, and they won, and they were acquitted by a jury. So every trial can go in different ways, but the key thing is that as a movement, we understand what that there is no guarantee about guilty or not guilty, but at the end of the day, we know that history will vindicate us all, and that we go in there with our heads held high, and we don't let them intimidate us into backing down against our morals, or into allowing them to make us think that we're criminals, because that's what the state does. When you've been so criminalized and oppressed, they're trying to get you to doubt what you're doing as well, in a sense. But actually, I think it's having the opposite effect now, where it's never felt like we're more on the right side than when we're facing all of this stuff from the state, because it just shows how, as you said, as we'll go on to talk about, how desperate they are to stop us and to protect Israel. And they see us as a real threat. And that is a very motivating place to be.
Yeah. No, thank you. So despite all of this, you all are continuing to train folks to take direct action. I appreciate the effort you're putting in terms of, keeping up the fight amid the repression. I just saw this morning a post about an action that was just taken. There was another one that I saw yesterday or the day before. And so just maybe talk a little bit about that from your perspective of, some efforts like this would, kind of turn inward, right? And say, okay, we have to combat the repression, we have to fight the cases, we have to defend ourselves. You all have continued to kind of proliferate, I guess, the number of actions that are taking place. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I think you can do both at the same time. I think that's what we're doing in terms of combating the repression, standing by those who are going to trial, and continuing the actions. And I think they all actually fit together. If you are being repressed, or for the prisoners, the most encouraging thing you can see is that people are standing in solidarity with you and are continuing to do what you did, which put you in prison in the first place, and that the repression hasn't worked. Because it's not an individual thing, it's a collective thing, right? So when they put one of us in prison, knowing that others are going to continue the fight means that they haven't succeeded. They haven't succeeded in stopping the collective movement. I would say though that a key thing is, we have a brilliant support team and a lot of people who work constantly to support activists, families, friends, of the prisoners and of people going to trial, who aren't always, who aren't the ones on the front line, but are doing a lot. And without them, this movement wouldn't be sustainable. And so that's a key way that people can also support, is by joining that team. But for a key thing, when we see what's going on, as I mentioned before, is we know that Elbit are threatened by what we're doing, and so is the British state. There's a guy called John Woodcock. He's a lord called Lord Walmley, his other name is. And he wrote a report and he was basically calling for us to be banned as a group. And in this report, he had a meeting with Elbit Systems. And Elbit had told him and complained of the detrimental impact that Palestine Action was having against their business in England. And at this point, when the state is doing everything possible to stop you, right, you don't get much further than using the Terrorism Act against people. I mean, it's not even something you you um, you take into consideration as a possibility. It's so far fetched. So when they've got to this point and they fail, or when they get to that point and they still fail to stop you, that's when you win. Because for Elbit, it's untenable. If they can't stop us, they have to leave. And they know that's the situation. So for us and for people in Palestine Action who are continuing to take direct action, they can see the sacrifices that others in this movement have made. They can see that people are sitting behind bars to shut down this company, and they want to continue that work and continue despite it. And we have many incredible people in Palestine Action, and people have been more motivated by what's going on. They said we cannot stop. We have to keep going. They are scared. We have to continue. We have to shut down this company. And so I think it's backfiring. And repression can often backfire on the state. And if anything, they're showing us that what we are doing is working against Elbit Systems. And Elbit they've hired lots of security guards. They hire ex-military security guards. They build new security fences. They've lost several sites already in England, have had to be shut down completely. When these things don't work and the state can't stop you, we are getting closer and closer to victory and to achieving our end goal of shutting down Elbit Systems. So in that sense, I think actually the state have given away the game. They've said that this is what we don't want happening. And if the state are telling you what they don't want to happen, and Elbit are telling you what they don't want to happen, Israel's biggest weapons company, then that is what exactly that's exactly what you've got to do.
Right on. Did you want to talk a little bit about this? There's a letter that
Yeah.
was published today in the Electronic Intifada. There was a section of it that I think I can pull up that you wanted to read. And you say a little bit about what
Yeah.
this is, maybe?
Yeah, so Francesca's been in prison for just over 2 months, and she took action against an American weapons manufacturer who supply parts for Israeli missiles and fighter jets. And she was arrested for taking action against Barclays and JP Morgan, 2 banks which both invest in Elbit Systems. And she's been on remand ever since she was arrested for those actions. But I just think that this is perfectly embodies what I've been saying, and comes from a prisoner. And I think it's important to show their voices. So she says, "I'm shocked and troubled to see our comrades labeled as terrorists and treated in the most repressive way imaginable. One judge even admitted he had to make an example of us, to humiliate and intimidate us in order to scare others from taking similar action. But we won't be discouraged. This is proof we're hitting them where it hurts. They punish us because they're scared. They know our actions are costing their precious corporations. Barclays is under immense pressure. Elbit Systems is being chased out, and Scotiabank is feeling the heat of its complicity. Their scare tactics will not work. In fact, they are a rallying call." And that's coming from somebody who's inside prison right now. So I don't think it can get any stronger than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And folks, that article is out today on the Electronic Intifada. I'll put a link in the chat, but I encourage people to read it. So I do want to talk about more ways that people can, support you all. I'm obviously, I do worry some about the impact that cases like these can have, as you say, as kind of scare tactics of like discouraging people from being willing to take this kind of action. Certainly, that is the intent that, as they've said, right, of their repression. Um, and I think it's really important the kind of activity that you all are engaged in because it poses a material problem for the continuation of this genocide and continuing to support the Israeli regime in its war crimes and everything else against the Palestinian people. So, yeah, anything in terms of ways people can support or other things you want to add on that?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the key ways is people are in England or wherever there's Palestine Action cases or just direct action cases in general. I think it's so important to show up for hearings. We advertise our hearings and our trials on our website so people from across the country can turn up and support them. People stand outside with banners and people sit inside the public gallery of these court cases. And it's also, being a witness to what's happening inside these courtrooms because, unlike the US, you cannot. It's not publicized. It's not recorded. Um, so it is important for people to show up and show support, and that support is tremendously meaningful and motivating. I'd say, when I was on trial myself, I had it every day. People coming in, bringing you food, just turning up, and just being able to talk to people during the breaks about what's going on. It just keeps you going really and keeps you motivated. Uh, Another thing which is really important is showing public support for the prisoners, for the 16 Palestine Action political prisoners. Whether that's a tweet, whether that's a Facebook post, sharing things on Instagram, talking about the fact that there is 16 prisoners. We are going to come out with more resources soon, like flyers and posters that people can distribute and spread awareness of the fact that there are political prisoners detained for trying to stop a genocide. Another key thing, which Francesca actually mentioned in the letter earlier on, about how motivating it was for her to receive letters and postcards. And we've had a few different groups across the country organize letter writing sessions, postcard writing sessions. Postcards are especially good because you can have pictures of things on your wall and getting these messages of support, showing that I think she said, it shows that your sacrifice is meaningful while you're inside, and generally talking about prisoners and these cases at protests, at speeches, and just making it visible everywhere. Because one of the key things that the state is trying to do to Palestine Action is they're trying to isolate Palestine Action from the rest of the movement and say this is an extreme element of it, right? Where arguably the most extreme thing going on is the fact that these factories are able to arm the ongoing genocide of Gaza. But they're trying to intimidate us to make it easier for them to oppress us and get away with it. And the most effective way of countering that is by the wider movement not allowing that to happen and showing their support consistently for Palestine Action. I would encourage people to do direct action, but even if you're not willing to do direct action, then at least support those who do and make that visible wherever you are at the protest constantly. Of course, we put Palestine first in all of this, but it's important, when people are put in prison, one of the key methods of the state is to try and make these people isolated themselves, literally, but also for the wider movement to forget about them. And you have to do the exact opposite: keep what they're doing alive, keep what their message was alive, and that way, that even when they're locked up in a prison cell, what they sacrifice for is still that message is still getting out there. And I think that's so important for the people who are being imprisoned and detained, and just to show our strength as a movement. And the same goes for the people who are being arrested right now, the journalists, the activists who are being charged under the Terrorism Act for, supposedly showing support for Hamas. These laws are so wide, right, that basically if they want to arrest you for it, they will find a way to arrest you for it because it's just so open to interpretation and it's a completely political move that's going on. But again, if we allow it to happen and if we isolate these people from the wider movement, then they're going to come for more and more and more people. And in a lot of ways, what's happening now in terms of the terrorism charges for speaking and for tweets is very similar to what we've seen before in England and across the world when it came to the people being smeared of for being anti-Semitic, for allegedly being anti-Semitic, you know, people would go through your Twitter, they go through your profiles, they'll try and find dirt on you, things that you said when you were a teenager, to try and use it against you and smear your name and get hit pieces on you. And, you know, some people lost jobs because of it, lost their reputation because of it. But now the difference is now that they can get counter-terrorism police come to your door, raid your home, charge you, and you can face up to 14 years in prison for saying, you know, for doing a speech or writing a post. I mean, you're probably not going to get 14 years. That's the maximum sentence, but still the principle still applies. So I think we have to fight back against this as a movement. But fighting back does not mean stopping the actions. If anything, stopping the actions is the most impactful way to fight back against the repression.
Yeah. I think that's an important distinction too for people to understand, just the legal distinction between the UK and the US is that there's certain things that you all that Palestine Action has done that I think would bring forth a lot of repression in the US that might have been stronger from earlier on, but the speech part in particular is different. You know,
Mm,
you all are not allowed to, you know, as you said, a proscribed organization, which basically means if the UK government sends somebody as a terrorist, then you're not in the United States, you can't provide material support. So you can't actually send money or resources or whatever to a
mm,
terrorist organization or a proscribed organization. But in the UK, you can't vocalize support for an organization that's deemed that way, right? And so I just want people to understand that distinction a little bit. And because in the United States, there's a lot of issues, and there's a lot of ways in which action is more
mm,
demonized and more likely to face more significant legal consequences faster, I think. But speech, we have a little bit more leeway here, whereas it's kind of the inverse there, although now with your cases, they're ramping up their repression on the action as well. And so I just think that's important for people to kind of understand that's
yeah,
very simplistic, and it's different in the United States because there's so many states and stuff like that. It's different state to state and all that stuff. But um, there is a little bit of a difference there in the two countries that way. Um, so there was this headline, and I wanted to talk to you about it, recently, that the UK had halted licenses to 30
mm,
weapons manufacturers. And this actually was kind of interesting in the United States because our State Department does these daily briefings, which are a joke and just really drive you nuts, right? Because they just, use every justification to explain why it's okay for Israel to bomb a hospital or a school or whatever. I mean, they're the most horrendous things. The people who do them should be brought up on war crimes charges and genocide complicity charges. But in this, there was a recent discussion where one reporter brought up, you know, so the UK has done this. It is said that these 30 licenses are no longer allowed because of, I guess, the likelihood that the weapons are being used in war crimes. And they were posing it to the US guy, and he was like, "Well, the laws are different. We're not gonna get in the way of what the UK says. We're not gonna say they're wrong. We're making our own determination," sort of thing. And this was like there was like a 15-minute back and forth because the reporter was like, "Well, if they're being used in war crimes, then like that's a problem in our law too." And
mm,
so anyways, but so there was that, which was interesting in its own right. But the bigger point is that there were 350 of these licenses, I think. So this is a very small, it's like 10%, maybe of the people of the firms that are, you know, making licenses that are selling weapons to Israel that had their license, limited or taken away. So anyways, I mean, I don't want to diminish that it doesn't have any significance. I think it shows again that the movement is um that they're feeling pressure to make certain accommodations due to the action, but at the same
mm.
time, clearly it doesn't go far enough to make the kind of impact that is necessary. But just talk a little bit about this from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, it's like a chink, in the unconditional support between Britain and Israel. But as you said, materially, it's really not that significant. When it's less than 10% of licenses that have been stopped, and also each license has a different amount of weapons you can send, and um, value of those weapons. So we actually don't know. It could be a lot less in terms of overall weapons being sent, or more that have been stopped. So they haven't actually been very transparent at all about what licenses have been stopped from which factories, in order for people to assess what's actually being stopped. But and at the same, so you have to see it in the inverse, right? And the interesting thing is here as well is the kind of media jump and say, "Oh, arms licenses are suspended between here and Israel," and they forget to mention that it's actually, in the headline, that it's less than 10%. And the other way of saying that is more than 90% of licenses are still going from this country, allowing weapons to be sent from here to Israel during a genocide. And what's interesting is that the government have admitted that what Israel is doing is likely to be war crimes, because that's the law that they had to suspend those licenses on the back of. So sending any license would therefore, by definition, be illegal to do, but they continue to do it. So I think this is really the bare minimum they could do, and actually shows that after this much, you know, petitions and protests and all of those things, that this is the most meaningful sanctions that they could impose in 11 months into a genocide. And as you probably know, our strategy isn't to appeal to the government to stop arms sales to Israel. Is that we go out and take direct action and make it untenable for companies to continue to export arms to Israel. The other side of that is that the UK government and the US government and governments all across the world buy weapons from Elbit Systems. And these weapons are tested on Palestinians. They market them as battle tested. They're developing new weaponry now during the ongoing genocide. So every time our government is making huge contracts with Elbit Systems for these new weapons that have just been tested, they're basically encouraging the occupation to continue, the genocide to continue, because they're getting this new technology that has been tested in Gaza first off the back of it. So that hasn't stopped. So they've only suspended a very small part of the overall arms trade between this country and Israel. And of course, we still have Elbit Systems allowed to operate in this country, making those weapons, making weapons which are tested on Palestinians. And so, for us, in one sense, it's vindication of the fact that the government is now admitting that they were knowingly committing crimes by continuing those export licenses before they stopped those 30 licenses, and that it was legally correct and obviously morally correct, we already know that, to take direct action against them. And it will be very interesting to see if they try and deny that when it comes to the court cases of actions that have happened since October 7th. So we'll see as those court cases unfold how they try and deny people the right to argue that those actions were taken lawfully because they were preventing crimes, because the legal case really has never been stronger in that sense. But ultimately, it does show that we just have to continue taking direct action. I think it also shows the limitations of appealing to the government. And we're 11 months in now, and we have a lot of power if we just go out there and shut down these factories ourselves. And so for us, that's a key thing that we're gonna continue to do.
I think we should say a little bit more about that too, because I know
Mm.
that there's a older interview people can check out that we did a couple years ago as an audio interview. But I don't want to take for granted that everybody that's listening today knows about your model, knows how to get involved if they want to. People who are interested in taking direct action. So maybe you could talk a little bit more, just outline for a few minutes, how Palestine Action sort of operates, the way that to what you can share, and how people can get trained. I know you have trainings that are coming up and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. So if you're in England, we have upcoming training days. So these are day sessions where people come along. they go through legal consequences, British complicity, and it gives people an opportunity to meet like-minded people in and to meet with those and discuss the fight to shut down the war machine. And and it's important to say as well, you know, when we talk about some of the bigger actions that people have done, bigger as in, you know, breaking inside the factory and destroying these weapons, like the Fulton activists had done and are in prison on the back of that. That there are many different types of actions within Palestine Action. We have accountable actions where people occupy sites and will get arrested and go to court afterwards. We had one today. I believe it's still ongoing, actually, and they shut down one of the Elbit weapons factories in Kent. And I think it was over 10 activists who have been shutting down that place using vehicles, paint, things like that. We had an action just last week against the lobbyists for Elbit Systems. These are huge corporate lobbyists who actually hire politicians who work for the firm, who have access to the prime minister and the government. And we targeted them as a way of exposing the fact that these corporate lobbyists are active, and that these secondary targets, these companies, whether they're the lobbyists, whether they're partners of Elbit, whether they are investors in Elbit, that they are also targets of our campaign. And there's also actions where people do things and they get away with it. Obviously, even when you take those types of actions, it's important to understand that you have to be prepared for the possibility that you could be arrested and you could be charged for it. But the intention, nonetheless, is not to get caught. It is to get away, and often those things happen at night. And there's varying degrees of different types of actions people can take. And when people come along to training days, they can understand the theory behind it a bit more before getting involved. So those are the key ways of getting involved. We do have groups in different countries, all of whom are autonomous. So they organize themselves, basically. But the principle of taking direct action as our core tactic and the strategy carries the same wherever we are, whether that's in Scotland, Italy, France, Germany, etc. So those are the key ways of getting involved in terms of direct action. And I also say we do have support teams. We have people who organize support in Palestine Action, and we do advertise workshops for new people to get involved in those teams. But to be honest, like, even if you just come along to court cases, and that's a key way of showing your support. And I say that wherever you are. You know, I know in the US there's different court cases going on of activists. It's important to show up for these things. It's important to show the state that these people are not alone, that we stand together as a movement, and that we also respect diversity of tactics wherever we are, because ultimately that's what's going to bring us closer to victory and to ending global complicity and showing meaningful solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for liberation.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that, and agree. This is a random kind of question, but has the change in prime minister, has that seemed to affect, some of the level of repression or the way that, um, you know, maybe your organization, but also like broadly the Palestinian solidarity movement has been kind of treated by the state?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence. It's well, it's not funny, but it's interesting how, you know, this is a Labour left-wing government, um, and it's the first time we've had people detained without charge under the Terrorism Act. Keir Starmer used to be the head of prosecution, but basically the ones who prosecute and charge people and take them to court in this country. And with that comes the knowledge of knowing how to abuse powers, knowing what legislation there is, and I think we're seeing more and more of that. You know, like I said, there's been a marked escalation in the past month, not long after Keir Starmer got into power. I mean, the Tory government wasn't much better, but as I said, this is new. and this has come under Keir Starmer's leadership, and it's a police state. I mean, when you've got people being arrested for saying words, like literally for tweets or for a comment. Sometimes, we've had one person arrested for um, they were having an argument with somebody on Twitter, and it was a comment. Probably 5 people saw it, and they got arrested. The house, the computers taken, tech taken. We are living in a police state. But ultimately, as I said before, it does show how scared the state is. I also think that Labour is very good at PR, so they know how to kind of keep majority of the public sweet, and they'll have like headlines like, oh, Labour is considering a 4-day working week at the same time that they're deploying terrorism laws against people for speaking up, right? And it's not even like they're doing these 4-day working weeks, they're just talking about it. And they've done this repeatedly. Before they put in this arms suspension, there were several headlines of articles, mostly from Daily Mail and Zionist newspapers, saying that, oh, the government's banned arms sales to Israel unofficially, and all of this stuff, and nothing has happened. And when it does happen, it's so meaningless. It's 30 licenses, but they had all of this good press where people think, oh yeah, look, they're really making a difference. Look how liberal our new government is. Isn't this great? While at the same time, pointing guns at people's heads for standing up against the genocide in order to protect Israel. So I think they are much more manipulative, and in that sense, it is much more authoritarian than we've had before. And I think a lot of people see through it. Yeah, I mean that's where we are, isn't it? It's just like rather the devil, or the devil in disguise, and yeah, he's a bit of a
Yeah.
devil.
No, I agree. I'm smiling because it reminds me a lot of like the tactics of the Democrats in the United States, that
Mm,
the kind of meaningless identity, reduction kind of politics, and just yeah, they'll we don't have much of that right now. It's just sort of like we're going to run on no policies and joy, and then amid a genocide basically. And yeah, so anyway, we'll be talking about that tonight. I have a couple people coming on. We're going to talk about um Kamala Harris and what's really dangerous about San Francisco liberalism. But
mm,
anyway, I really appreciate you, Huda. I appreciate all the people, known and unknown, who are a part of Palestine, part of the actions and the work that you all have been doing with Palestine Action. And is there anything else that you want to share or say in closing?
I think I forgot to mention that we have online workshops as well, but again, you can find that on our website. I think that's the key thing, and I just want to say thank you for constantly giving us a platform. Um, times like this, it's really appreciated to be able to go into depth about what's going on, so people can see and support the prisoners and the wider movement. And so I appreciate you. We appreciate you as a movement.
Well, I super appreciate you all, and I do want to genuinely let you know. I think I've said this to you before, but and I responded quickly when someone reached out. But like,
Mhm.
seriously, anytime that you all want to come on, you are welcome to, and we would love to have you. So anyway, yeah, our solidarity with you. I hope people listen. The other thing I wanted to say that you didn't mention, but it might be,
Mm,
so there is a legal defense fund. Is
yeah.
that if people are in the United States, they can support that way, right? To the cases that you all are engaged in. Is that helpful?
Yes, 100%, 100%.
Yeah. So that's also in the show description for folks. I also had put it in the chat. But yeah, any way that folks can get involved, can take direct action, be a part of a support committee, show up at trials, contribute to the defense fund, all of those things are good ways for people to support the work that you are doing, which again, I hope that everybody's clear on this, but that's connected, of course, and important to the struggle in Palestine. It's not just that we're doing it just to help you all as
Mm,
activists or whatever, right? But because It's important that we be able to stop the genocide and to continue until Palestine is free. Somebody asked a question I can pull up here. So they said, "How are you dealing with Elbit moving their factories to countries where the justice system is much harder to navigate by activists? Africa, is that part of your strategy?" I mean, probably
Mhm.
not, because it's mostly. Well, I'll let you say. I know you're autonomously kind of set up. So
Yeah, I mean, as I said, we are autonomously set up, and we'd encourage people to take global action. But for the first 3 years of Palestine Action, we were only based in England and Scotland. And for us, it's very. Not only is it about the practical inconvenience for Elbit Systems of having to move from England, it's a political disaster for them when they can't operate out of a country that Israel deems one of their strongest allies, and not because our government is refusing to allow them to be here, but because the people took such consistent and radical action against them that they couldn't afford to stay in this country. And politically, that's extremely important, especially when we are, in the imperial core. And that's across Europe and in the US and in Australia, as well as in other countries. We should be resisting Elbit systems wherever they are. But Elbit systems, they thrive on being able to be accepted globally. Israel thrives on being able to be accepted globally. And so we actually have an opportunity when we are in Western countries to isolate Israel from their strongest and most important allies. And so that's a huge part of the strategy of Palestine Action.
yeah, right on. A lot of people just, sending support and appreciation for what you all did. Yeah, thank you so much. I think that this has been great, and you're welcome anytime to come on, and we can continue it if there's specific things that we want to talk about or issues you want to delve into more deeply. You're always welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.